Ready when you are.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the quarterfinal of the 29th World Schools Debating Championship in Bali, Indonesia. My name is Aya and I will be the chairperson of this debate, while Adeline here will be the timekeeper. In this debate, each speaker will have 8 minutes to make their speech. After 1 minute, the timekeeper will signal once like this. After this, the debaters on the other team may offer points of information to the speaker. Debaters must stand up when they offer points of information. The speaker who has the floor may choose to accept or decline a point when it is offered. At 7 minutes, the timekeeper will again signal once. After this, no more points of information may be offered for the rest of the speech. At 8 minutes, the timekeeper will make a double signal like this. After this, the speaker must conclude within a few seconds. There will be a short break at the end of each speech for the judges to complete their notes. After the 6 main speeches, each team will have the opportunity to make a 4-minute reply speech. This can be made by either the first or second speaker on each team. No points of information are allowed during reply speeches. The opposition will make the reply speech first. After 3 minutes, the timekeeper will signal once to let the speaker know they have 1 minute left. After 4 minutes, the timekeeper will signal twice. Before the debate begins, I would like to remind you to switch off all mobile phones and anything else which might disturb the debaters. Should you need to leave or re-enter the room for any reason during the debate, please wait until the end of the speech to do so. Audience members should be aware that they may not participate in the main debate. There will be an opportunity to make comments after the judges have left the room at the end of the debate. I would now like to introduce the judges for this debate. They are Kip Ubanda, who is the chair judge for today's debate. Scott Ralston, Tasnim Elias, Yoni Cohen, and Nina Tabianan. In proposition for this debate, we have the team from the United States. The first speaker is Ella Michaels. Their second speaker is Aditya Aryadar. And the third speaker is Ali Grossman. The reply speech will be delivered by Aditya. And in opposition, we have Tim from Peru. Their first speaker is Lorenzo. The second speaker is Lorenzo. Their third speaker is Rafael. The reply speech will be delivered by Lorenzo.
Which one?
The second speaker. The motion for today's debate is this House would impose additional taxes on employers who use automation to replace human workers. To start off this debate, we call upon the first speaker of the opposition.
49%. That is the percentage of workers who will lose their jobs to automation by 2033 if it continues to progress at its current rate. 16 years from now. That is nearly half of the population that is going to lose their livelihood and ability to provide for themselves and their family, all in the name of ostensibly increasing productivity. Because we believe the government has a responsibility to stem the tide of automation, we are so proud to propose. What does our world look like? Before I move into introducing the first two substantive arguments from side proposition, we think in our world, governments would levy a tax on corporations proportional to their use of automation that directly replaces human workers. We think this automation looks like machinery where all of the functions are performed by automation or electronic devices and almost exclusively entail some kind of artificial intelligence. We would like to stipulate that we define this as labor replacing automation, not labor enhancing automation. We don't think it looks like something like a conveyor belt or a tool or a surgical robot that helps a human perform their job better, but rather looks like an independent machine that directly replaces a human worker. We would then use the revenue that we gain from this tax on automation to be used towards job retraining programs and things like that for workers who do lose their jobs to automation. What is our stance in today's debate? We are not saying that automation is exclusively or unilaterally bad. We recognize that it may have some benefits, and we also recognize that it is probably inevitable. However, we recognize that at the current pace of automation, it is far, far too rapid and destabilizes economic consequences for workers and people at the current rate at which it is progressing. With that, let me introduce the first substantive argument from side proposition on how the government has a principled obligation to pursue this policy. Two layers under this, the first on government responsibility and the second on when market intervention is justified. But first on government responsibility. So who do we think that automation disproportionately benefits? Overwhelmingly, the gains are concentrated in the top socioeconomic spheres of society. Rich business owners cut down on operating costs, save money, and get more revenue, often at the expense of blue-collar workers who lose their jobs and no longer have to be paid and no longer have a livelihood as a result of this. It's incredibly disproportionately unequal. But what do we think that the government's responsibility is? We think it is to serve and protect all members of society, and we also think they have a special obligation to the most vulnerable members of society because those are the ones most in need of their assistance. This is literally the government's job. They are accountable to their people, and they're given considerable power by their civilians to limit natural rights and implement policies that are supposed to benefit their workers. We think that an automation tax fulfills this responsibility because it redistributes the incredibly unequal privilege that automation inherently generates. And furthermore, we think it also is an important moral signal as well, because in addition to being instrumentally good, taxes also are a principled stance about what the government supports and does not support. For example, a tax on wealth is a principled stance against inequality, something the government ought not support, and sin taxes are a principled stance against certain behaviors that the government would not endorse. This is a stance against the inequality that automation generates, something that the government has a principled obligation to support. Our second layer under this argument is on when market intervention is justified. So what exactly is the government justified in limiting corporate activities? We think it's at the point where there are negative external harms to other members of society outside of those corporations. Even if limiting those harms does ostensibly decrease the productivity of that industry and potentially limit its ability to function exactly how it wants to. We think that this policy is analogous to things like labor regulations that protect workers from abuses from corporations, even though obviously labor regulations are going to incur cost to businesses and probably decrease their own growth opportunities. We still think that the government has an obligation to step in and regulate these harms. I will take you in a moment. Furthermore, we think it's analogous to something like a payroll tax, which may take away benefits from certain individual members of society, but is important for the collective good. Before I move on to our second argument, go.
Do you think governments are legitimate in mandating companies to hire unemployed people?
Not necessarily, but we think that they have an obligation not to unilaterally just completely fire all workers in the name of increasing productivity. And furthermore, we think that that automation is inherently unequal, and we don't recognize that it's completely unilaterally bad. We just think the government has an obligation to regulate it because the pace at which it is happening right now is really harmful. Our second substantive argument is on how slowing automation is practically beneficial for the economy at large. Before we introduce the layers under this argument on decreasing unemployment and increasing competition through this policy, let's just establish that we do think that automation is probably inevitable. This policy just decreases the pace of automation by making it much more expensive for companies to invest in these technologies in the first place. We're not completely eliminating any form of technological innovation or anything like that. We're just making sure that the pace is much more reasonable. So with that, two layers under this argument. The first, on increasing unemployment. So this is not a serious question that is disputed by any economist. Automation unilaterally decreases employment because when you just replace jobs with robots, that obviously is going to decrease the number of jobs available to individuals and their ability to access a meaningful livelihood. This is exemplified by the statistic that we provided you at the top of our speech. 49% of current existing jobs are going to be replaced by automation by 2033 in just 16 years. That is half of the population that not only is not going to be able to, that not only is not going to have a job, but also the job that they are trained for and qualified for, and the kinds of jobs that they are going to be able to get are literally no longer going to exist because of automation. That is absolutely massive, and we recognize that automation might be inevitable, but because of the short time frame of this massive change, that is going to result in a really huge market shock, where massive amounts of people are going to be left without their jobs, with very little time to adjust, very little time to retrain, and they're essentially going to be left behind by this market. We have a practical justification for limiting this. We think by decreasing the pace of automation, we limit these harms. Why is unemployment so harmful? We think that the unemployed are the poorest and most vulnerable in society because they are absolutely without an income. But also, they are much less likely to get retrained for another job after they lose their current one, leaving them absolutely helpless when the only things that they are qualified for no longer exist. Our second layer under this argument is on how this policy increases in competition. In the status quo, the initial investment costs in automation, though they yield long-term benefits, are relatively high, meaning that only large businesses with a significant amount of capital are generally able to take advantage of these technologies. Small businesses generally can't compete. This creates a disproportionate advantage for these larger businesses because they can decrease operating costs and be much more competitive. We think this results in two things. One, you shut small businesses out of the market and make it so that they can't enter and innovate those industries. But second, you entrench industry giants who now have much less of an incentive to be productive, and in the long term, pseudo-monopolies essentially control entire markets and don't have an incentive to benefit their consumers. This, in the long term, decreases growth, real wages, and increases prices for the consumers that the opposition is probably going to say that they're trying to benefit. We believe in limiting the pace of this rapid change, increasing competition, increasing growth, and protecting workers. Thank you.
The first proposition speaker spent 8 minutes and 18 seconds. To start the case of opposition, we call upon the first speaker of the opposition.
Automation has been going on since the first cotton spinning machine was invented. It has brought nothing but benefits to society and the world support. We think that we should not stop this march to progress. Before going on to 3 arguments, let's present some rebuttal to the proposition. First of all, regarding the model, they told us that this will not apply to labor-enhancing machinery. We think this is really weird, because labor-enhancing machinery also increases efficiency and decreases the amount of labor that you need in certain companies. So we think that there's a little bit of case tension with your model. Then you told us that you would use money to retraining in cases people were fired. We think we can also do these sorts of things. But most fundamentally, the whole characterization that Team USA brought to us, and the characterization on which the model and the whole case was really fundamented upon, was that the pace of automation was so quick, they would see extremely harmful effects towards society. We think that we cannot accept this fear-mongering by Team USA. Automation will not occur so quickly. Why? A few reasons. First of all, many times the technology simply does not exist to automate certain jobs. You have to deal with those scenarios. Secondly, companies are many times fearful. They do not want to be the first ones that take step forward and implement automation because they do not know how exactly it will work. Thirdly, there are things like labor contracts that limit the capability of companies to then throw workers out of the window. Now that we've dealt with this, let's go directly to the arguments. The first one regarding the principle. First, they told us that income accumulation will be extreme, and we need to stop this. First of all, we already have things like progressive taxation for income differences. No thing you have to prove to us why there's a fundamental difference between gaining income through AI and automation than gaining income through any other sort of way. But secondly, I'll deal with the second thing further on. Then you told us the government should protect workers. This is a utilitarian point that's hung on all your benefits, so this is not really a principle. I'll deal with your utilitarian benefits further on. And then you told us that this sends the message that government is against inequality. Like the government already sends the message that it's against inequality. That's why you have things like taxes and like welfare.
Exactly.
No, thank you. Then they went on to the second thing about how it protects workers and the government should protect workers. Okay, the fundamental assumption with this point is that companies have a duty towards the workers, and we think that they simply do not have this duty, and they have been unable to provide companies. No, thank you. Have a duty towards the worker. When we asked you, would you force companies to hire unemployed workers? You told us no. This is because you agree with us in principle. Companies simply do not have this duty to help workers. A second argument regarding jobs. Many responses. First of all, these companies still need workers. No thing. This is because after automation, companies have more money and industries can grow. They can have more places where they work and thus gain more people that work. Second, you need people to supervise and repair these things. And we think that there are many jobs that only humans can do, such as nursing and teachers. And we think that the jobs on the parts of the house are better, they're more specialized, they give you more money for these people. Secondly, we think that this changes over a long period of time. Some jobs will take longer to automate because of things like testing, and you can't fire workers immediately because of things like labor contracts. Thirdly, we think that human wants are unlimited and many current jobs aren't necessary but were recently created anyways. We asked Team USA to not be so chronocentric about the way they view society. Like we went from an agricultural society to a manufacturing society to a society that is based on services. Why can't the next society be based on things, nothing like entertainment? Why can't you just imagine a world where like, the jobs change? But more importantly, we think that corporations still need consumers to work. So we think that forces of the market will generate more jobs with people that are capable of buying these products. The companies will always need people employed to work. Then they told us about competition, and this is basically like big companies will have these things, and this is bad for small companies because small companies can't have these things. First of all, would you ban big companies from buying like machinery that small companies simply can't have? This is exactly the same principle. We think that this is absurd. Most importantly, we think that innovation is the thing that destroys big companies, such as Blockbuster being destroyed by Netflix. And most importantly, we think that these things really require so many barriers of entry, like many times to implement automation, you just need approval. Now let's move on to our argumentation. First argument about a principle of efficiency. This argument proves that in principle is incorrect and fundamentally unjustified to tax automation. And we believe that automation is analogous to any increase in efficiency, and punishing efficiency is unfair. So why is automation analogous to any other form of increase in efficiency? This is because if a company decides to automate, it is making its outputs require less inputs. It makes it less costly to develop products and create goods. Critically, automation makes companies require less workers, but any other sort of increase in efficiency does exactly the same thing. For example, if a company trains its workers, it requires less workers, it is increasing its efficiency, it is requiring less workers. If agriculture companies buy fertilizers that lead to better yield, it leads to less use of land and it leads to less use of workers. It is increasing its efficiency. If the company hires a better manager that restructures the company and cuts costs, it leads to less use of workers, it increases efficiency, and it cuts off on jobs. All this leads to improvements in efficiency that lead to less workers being hired. And we asked Team USA, would you feel comfortable with taxing all forms of increases in efficiency? Because automation is analogous to all of them. And crucially, it is unfair to tax automation just because it is automation, because automation is analogous to other forms of increase in efficiency. And we think that it is bad to tax efficiency. This is because the core foundation of our capitalist system is based on our capabilities to be efficient. This is what lets people be comparatively better than other companies. It is what increases competition and lets a functioning economy work in the status quo. You will be destabilizing one of the main axioms under which our society actually functions. So in principle, it is wrong to tax automation because it is analogous to all of the forms of increases in efficiency. Moving on to the second argument, the benefits of automation. This argument will prove that automation is extremely important to society, and reducing the pace of automation or stopping it completely is extremely important. 3 layers of analysis within this argument. Before moving on,
labor regulations decrease efficiency for corporations. Are they principally justified because they will protect workers?
No. The difference is that labor regulations apply equally to all of the companies. This means that you're not creating any unfair disadvantages between certain companies that use automation and certain companies that do not use automation. Now let's move on to the 3 layers within this argument. How automation benefits society. This will prove that even if we lose jobs, our comparative is better because it benefits society, and we will be willing to lose jobs to benefit society. First, how does automation help people? First, it leads to an accessibility of goods. Automation leads to more efficiency and cheaper goods. They've already conceded to this, so I don't think it requires much explanation. And this leads to tangible benefits to society. For example, you have cheaper cars, and it's not like you'll be having a few hundred more bucks in your pocket. But this means that workers have the capability to have other jobs because they can travel longer distances. It reduces your cost of living. Things like having cheaper medicine and medical processes. Now when you go to the hospital and you want to have a TB check, you do not have to have a very advanced medical student checking your x-rays. You can have a machine doing it. This makes it much more accessible for poor people to have these sorts of things that are extremely important for the health, for the development. Second layer of how automation benefits society. I think that automation processes are safer than non-automated processes. One of the main causes of death in the world are car accidents. And self-driving cars and drugs that take away jobs from people that drive these cars and drugs, which take the lives of hundreds of thousands of people in the status quo. Second, you can have things like better medical checks, as we already told you. Things like machines operating on you rather than humans that have their hands trembling while they try to operate on your open heart. But the third layer of analysis within this argument, we think that Team USA is essentially taxing green energy. This is because green energy is automating the process of collecting energy for society. With green energy, you do not need workers because all the processes are automated. Computers decide how the wind turbines move, how the solar panels are gyrating where they are located, and this takes away jobs from people like coal miners. So we think that it's essentially harmful to tax this very specific sort of development because our society depends on creating better energy for development because the harms of climate change are extremely terrible. Overall, it's in principle unjust for them to tax any sort of efficiency, and most importantly, automation is good for society. We oppose the motion.
First opposition speaker spent 8 minutes and 6 seconds. Proposition, we call upon Aditya.
What does opposition come to within today's debate? The idea of the free market, the idea of competition and the principle of efficiency. I'm sorry it had to be someone from the free market capitalist-loving America to tell you this, but sadly, the free market is not absolute. We think industrial regulations on labor are very important at the point where, yes, they may decrease efficiency, but they're principally good in that they support workers. We would principally stand for things like a carbon tax because we think businesses, for example, don't always understand that there are social costs to their actions, and at that point, it's the government's obligation to intervene in those markets. 3 things in this speech. First, 2 clarifications on what we stand for, then 2 questions of rebuttal on the principle and practical, and finally, bringing up our 3rd argument. So first, a question about the model. Here's what they tell you. They tell you automation's not as fast as they tell us, right? They tell you this is true for 3 reasons. First, because labor contracts are there. Second, because some of the technology just doesn't exist. And third, because corporations don't want to. We think their 3rd point about corporations not wanting to automate kind of directly clashes with their principal rebuttal to our argument when they said, well, corporations don't have a duty to workers. Okay, if corporations don't have a duty to workers, what disincentive is there for them not to automate in the first place, right? But second, the idea that the technology doesn't exist. No, the technology does exist. Huge swaths of the manufacturing sector across the globe have been replaced by robots. But third, there's this idea of labor contracts. Okay, corporations have a huge imbalance in power. They're going to be able to skew their way out of labor contracts. But second, we would say, okay, they just stop hiring people. They don't have to sign these labor contracts in the first place. All they're doing is automating, right? So automation, the pace of it is significantly high. We tell you by 2033, you're going to see 49% of workers being replaced. The second clarification is the idea that they bring to us in a point of information in Ella. When they say, does government have an obligation to force companies to hire people? First, we tell you, obviously, that's not what we're standing for, this is a tax. But second, that's literally not what our principle is about. It's a point about a market correction, right? We tell you there is a market imbalance at the point where an automation creates like negative externalities specifically for the workers by increasing unemployment. That's the principle justification that we have. Let's go on to the principle in that point. What is their principle? It's a principle out of efficiency and about competition. 5 responses to this. First, this is not a principle. If you base your principle on efficiency and competition, it requires you to prove that efficiency and competition both exist. But second, regularly, we think efficiency correlates with more workers being hired. Why is this not true in the case of automation? What we see in automation is that when companies increase efficiency, they don't use it to hire more workers, they just use it to buy more robots, right? So that's why we stand for regulations, that's why we stand for efficiency in the status quo, because it helps more workers get hired. Third response on the contradiction that they have in a point of information. Look, if they stand for a principle of efficiency, they need to tell you why exactly they support things like worker regulations that do, yes, decrease efficiency. But fourth, we think the whole point about competition hinges on the idea that competition actually exists, right? What do we actually think happens? Because small businesses are shut out by the disproportionate use by big businesses, right? Why does this actually happen? What we would tell you is that because the cost is so prohibitively expensive that it's only being used on a large scale in big businesses, right? This shuts down small businesses. Why is this important? First, because it decreases competition. Why is this important? Because it decreases productivity, it decreases the quality of goods, but also we think it increases sectoral unemployment at the point where you literally have stagnant industries that don't face competition, right? They don't have a principled stance in this round. Let's go to the second point, the idea of the benefits for automation. We would say that they're focusing on a very small segment of what automation actually looks like, right? What do they tell you? First, they tell you about like medical robots and stuff like this. We would say x-rays aren't exactly like automation replacement. Like we don't think a human can somehow use x-ray vision to see into your chest and identify things, right? That's not automation. What is automation and why do we support it in this specific thing? What we would tell you, for example, is a surgical robot that is able to be more precise than a human. Specifically, a surgical robot can fulfill tasks that humans can't. First of all, are almost overwhelmingly operated by doctors themselves. But second of all, they're literally doing tasks that humans can't do in the status quo. We think at that point, they're not actually replacing robots, right? Let's go to their second idea about self-driving cars. First of all, what we would remind you of is that trucking industry, like across the world, is a massive economic industry. At the point where you have this kind of self-driving car, you're literally only feeding into the unemployment that we tell you. But third, this is their idea in the route, that increased access happens with more automation. When you have increased unemployment, you lower the amount of people that can actually get access to these goods. What do we tell you on the practical? We give you 2 different mechanisms by which their side leads to economic devastation, right? We tell you first, because automation increases unemployment in such a rapid fashion, it decreases the ability to train. Workers can't get better jobs in sectors, right? So what did we see in the Industrial Revolution? That's their example. Workers were able to adapt because the pace was far slower. In cases where the pace was rapid, we saw massive unemployment, right? That's why the Industrial Revolution is actually a comparable model to what we have today. But the second point is about small businesses. We tell you why competition actually matters. What is their response to our practical argument? No, because workers transition from the agriculture to the manufacturing sector, they can now transfer from the manufacturing sector to the service sector, and from the service sector to the entertainment sector. Look, obviously, not everyone's as popular as Team Peru. Like, we can't all be pop stars, right? Well, we would love it if that entertainment sector could actually happen, but we don't think this is feasible. What is the feasible model instead? We tell you it's our model, one that increases worker retraining programs, because that's the only way they're going to get sustainable jobs in the long run. Yes?
Would you impose additional taxes on companies that are already automated?
Yes, that's like point. Like our model says that we would impose it on the proportion of artificial intelligence being used. Let's go to our third argument about increasing right-wing reactionary policies. How does this happen? 3 mechanisms. First, increase unemployment. Job replacement creates a new group of marginalized and vulnerable voters that don't have a cohesive political identity oftentimes. Oftentimes what happens is that we see a recent global trend of populists preying on the unemployed. So we saw Nigel Farage in the United Kingdom basically preying on the fears of unemployed voters to the point that most unemployed voters ended up voting for Brexit. Our side solves this by decreasing unemployment. Second, increasing anti-government sentiment. The immediate economic consequences of automation without a government reaction like a robot tax increase people's disdain with the government. Also, increasing their dissociation with existing political identities. For example, coal workers in the United States feeling not represented by a Democratic Party that did nothing to protect them from unemployment, right? So people feel disenfranchised and they're more likely to buy into right-wing reactionary sentiment. For example, voters for Marine Le Pen in France said overwhelmingly that they felt the government wasn't doing enough to address economic concerns. Our side solves this by having the government take action. But third, we would say you increase fear-mongering. What do populists do? They tell their base, I'm the only one who can stop automation, as you can see, because no one else is trying to stop automation. This increases like a fervent devotion among their base. Our side solves this because the government is taking action. What are the harms of the right-wing reactionary policies on their side? First, obviously you have anti-minority policies being enacted, but even if the populists themselves aren't being elected, we see growing atmospheres of hate and violence against minorities increasing. But, moreover, we would say that economically devastating policies are enacted, like Brexit, policies that are literally devastating to workers that I'm sure both sides of the House actually wants to protect. At that point, we would say that when you don't act to stop automation, people start to hate the government, and when they do, all they do is lash out against them, lash out against their communities, and that's why we see much more violence, much more economic disaster on their side of the House.
Automation is nothing new. It has been occurring since the first breath of the steam engine, since the first choo-choo of the Inter-American Railroad. Let us not stop it in its tracks. Two broad points where I will refute everything said by the proposition. Firstly, about the responsibility of government. Secondly, about the tangible effects of this policy. Then, I will move on to our third argument about investment and moonshot projects. Let's begin with this first point about the responsibility of government. The first thing they told us is that automation replaces the most vulnerable and the government has a duty to protect them. Okay, this is hung on effects, which I will refute later, but also we think that we can already do things like impose higher progressive taxes if we want to help the most vulnerable. It is absurd to say that automation is the only cause of increasing inequality. You have massive corporations that do not depend on automation, lobbying governments to reduce welfare. So it's not the only cause of what they're talking about. The next thing they told us is that there are negative social harms against society which justify government intervention. We say that there is an important nuance that we have to consider, and it is that companies have different degrees of duty towards different individuals. So we say, as they concede, that companies do not have a duty towards unemployed individuals, which is why we don't force them to hire them. What they told us is that they do have a duty towards the people that are working for them, and they would be fired under our side of the house. What we say is that labor contracts exist and that those would have to be regulated and respected. The response about how large companies have so much legal infrastructure that they would just not have to respect it is false, because if you immediately fire a significant number of workers without respecting the most basic clauses in your contracts, of course there is A, legal recourse, and B, capacity for things like collective action lawsuits. But furthermore, we gave you a very clear principle about how it was wrong to tax efficiency. The response was that things like labor regulations already make companies inefficient. We say there is a significant distinction because a difference is that a company actively exploiting a worker it has hired is different from a company choosing not to use the labor of a worker. This is very different because if I am not taking a worker into my company and exploiting him, like the fact that I am not employing him does not mean that I am trampling upon his rights. Significant difference that they need to engage with. Having proven that their policy stands on no principled grounds and that it contradicts like a very important principle of like free market economies that you shouldn't tax efficiency, we say our principle is more consistent. POI.
Our principle was never that companies have an obligation to their workers. In fact, you're right, they don't. Our principle was that the government has an obligation to correct when companies abuse their workers and don't uphold these rights.
Okay, I'm going to talk about why your company, why the government doesn't do anything good for people in the second flashpoint about effects. So let's get it. The most important idea presented by side proposition is that the rate at which automation was occurring was so fast and so significant that we needed to do this or else so many people would be unemployed. So two important points. The first is that it's quite unclear what side proposition is actually taxing. Because they tell us there are wide systems of machinery in the status quo that already employ people. But then they tell us we would tax exclusively artificial intelligence. Ladies and gentlemen, one of the most significant reasons why people are being unemployed in the status quo has to do with machinery that isn't artificial intelligence. Things like car companies having robots which are pre-programmed to do specific tasks and they don't actually have things like artificial intelligence. So what that means is that a lot of the unemployment which supposedly happens in their characterization of the world isn't actually taxed. So they don't make a significant difference there. But let's talk about the extent to which artificial intelligence is like killing jobs so quickly. We think there are many systemic reasons about why it doesn't occur very quickly. First of all, the technology in many areas doesn't exist. They tell us, well, it does exist, this is why lots of people have lost their jobs. Firstly, like I already said, a lot of this technology isn't taxed. But secondly, crucially, different industries have different gradations of how advanced a technology is. So like the fact that a specific industry has an advanced technology doesn't mean that every other industry has it as well. That means it is much more likely that workers can transition between industries in the status quo. We can also provide them with job training. The second important thing is that companies oftentimes want other companies to take a lead. Because what they fail to understand is that changing the entirety of your manufacturing processes, if you're a company, from one day to the next entails a massive risk. How do you know that your servers are going to be secure? How do you know that they are not going to collapse? There is a large incentive to A, have small trials in the sense that a minority of workers are in place, so that the majority of workers keep on doing the same tasks until you develop the technology further, or B, you just wait for other companies to do it. What that means is that companies in the status quo have an incentive to wait and make the transition between workers and artificial intelligence much slower. No thank you. What that means, like the fact that they hung so much of their analysis about how jobs would be lost on the idea that it was quickly means, the fact that we have proven that it isn't fast means a lot of jobs will not be lost. But there is more analysis about why their side of the house doesn't actually lead to more employment. Firstly, we think that when industries grow more jobs are created overall. So for example, in the past, people were afraid that the creation of ATMs would lead to the destruction of the job of bankers. We think that the fact that we make, for example, banking cheaper means more banks and bank branches can open in the first place. Like some companies might have cheaper processes, so for any given good or service, less people are necessary, but you produce more goods and services and you hire more people. And crucially, even under their side of the house, we think that human workers are going to be necessary. You need them to do things like supervise other workers, replace and monitor machines. But moreover, we think that there are many human individual qualities that cannot be mimicked by machines. You have things like industries that require human contact, particularly the service industry. You have things like industries that require human creativity, which robots are nowhere near like the capacity to be able to emulate. So there are other industries that potentially could be created under our side of the house. The next thing they tell us is that they encourage competition. Okay, first of all, that assumes that robots always have high initial costs, which isn't always true. Things like artificial intelligence can be like done by like a coder in like a basement or whatever. I don't see why a large startup cost is necessary. Secondly, please give me a substantial reason about why large companies cannot compete with other large companies. Like the world doesn't have like a single big company per industry. Thirdly, will the proposition ban things like large machinery, which is expensive and accessible exclusively to large companies? Furthermore, we provided a significant amount of benefits about things like cheaper consumer goods, like people being better able to access transportation. We gave this point about like X-rays. They say X-rays aren't artificial intelligence. No, but doctors analyze these X-rays even though machines are A, cheaper, and B, better able to identify diseases. Of course, doctors would lose their jobs if like their job is to analyze X-rays and robots would do that instead. Okay, things like self-driving trucks. Are you seriously telling me that the trucker industry has a greater right than hundreds of thousands of people that die from car accidents every year? You need to prove that to me. The next thing they tell us about right-wingers and anti-government sentiment that is hung on the idea of more jobs, which I've already refuted, but in any case, right-wingers would probably be energized against a policy that involves a large government trampling upon the free market. Okay, let's move on to our third argument about investment and mutual politics. Many investments in the status quo have a high risk, which means they need a high reward. Things like small startups that are very likely to fail, but the possibility of success means huge rewards. We think that when you impose taxes upon their processes, it is less likely that investment would happen. This leads to negative impacts. Firstly, there is less long-term technological development, but B, there can be spin-off benefits from the technology in areas like engineering and computer science that don't actually involve artificial intelligence or machinery. Their policy prevents the natural progress of economies towards becoming more productive, hiring more people, and providing cheaper and better goods. We oppose.
The second opposition speaker spent 8 minutes and 12 seconds. Continue the case of proposition, we call upon Ali.
Little confused on what Team Peru's world actually looks like. Is it one where automation is a really big deal and we get massive gains in efficiency in this beautiful free market capitalistic world they support, or is it a world where automation is so scary businesses don't adopt it at all? Like, I prefer that they take a stance, but it's a little late in the round for them to actually do that. So a few things in this speech. First, I'll discuss our model and how they haven't exactly accurately represented it. Second, I'll delve into a comparative, and then I'll address two core areas of clash in today's round. First, which side is principally correct, and second, which side is best for workers in the economy. Let's talk about our model. What does Ella tell you and what have we carried down the bench? What we're going to tax are companies that use high levels of labor-replacing robots. That's really important because all of their offense when they tell us, oh, it helps workers, is about labor-enhancing technology. We think those are two different things. We think not only does our motion demand that, also that was protected time, but like the very motion talks about replacing workers, not giving them more tools to use in the workplace. They are not engaging with the heart of the motion. But the next thing we tell you is that the profits in our model will be used to retrain these workers and put them into the sectors they talk about, which are hard to automate. They say they can do this on their side of the house. I don't know how. It's a pretty big assertion. But now, let's delve into the comparative. What does their world look like? We tell you in their world, the pace of automation increases. 49% of jobs will be fully automated by 2033. They don't think so. What are the reasons they give you? First, they tell you that technology doesn't exist. We tell you, it will by 2033. Even if this doesn't happen in 2017, the pace is increasing. They do nothing to control that. Second, they tell you, oh, labor conflict solved this problem. Aditya addresses this, they don't engage. He tells you that often since these are large corporations, it's easy for them to squirrel out of these contracts and win lawsuits, but furthermore, they just don't hire new workers. They replace them with robots. That avoids that issue as well. At that level, we see these large businesses which can afford the initial cost of automation absolutely dominating the market. Businesses otherwise are shut down and workers are left on the streets. But then, what do we tell you our world looks like? We tell you it's one where we actually protect workers, where the government actually exerts an effort to defend workers and to defend the smaller businesses within an industry that's being overtaken by large monopolies. Because again, we don't think Blockbuster and Netflix are actually reflective of what automation and that trend truly looks like. We tell you, at that level, you also increase the steam for movements like populism when the government abandons people, which they so generously respond to with like 2 sentences in opposition to. But then, which side is principally correct in today's round? What are the principles we we bring to you. The first one is on government obligation. They misconstrue this across the bench and tell you, oh, corporations don't have a duty to workers. That's literally not what we're talking about. Let's talk about government obligation. What do we tell you? We tell you on their side of the house, blue-collar workers are left behind. Half of these jobs are being completely abandoned. We don't think that's comparable to the labor-enhancing technology they talk about like 200 years ago. We tell you that when people give away their rights to the government, they expect the government to protect them. That is why the government has an obligation to the vulnerable. Lorenzo, the first one, just in case you're confused, wraps this argument in a bow and hands it over to us when they say progressive taxation is the way in which we protect the vulnerable. Like, duh, that's the motion. That is our model. We are telling you that you don't tax robots. You don't give them an income. We solve for that on our side of the house by actually imposing these taxes on this business and replacing the progressive taxation that would normally happen on workers. Thank you for giving this argument to me. But furthermore, we give you another argument, which is that, there's a moral signaling value that the government has, that the government has to take a stance against things that are hurting workers and hurting the vulnerable. That's something we don't engage with. We don't believe this is contingent on a practical argument. We believe that the government should be taking a stance in favor of the vulnerable regardless of the practical. But what's the next thing we tell you? When is intervention justified? We tell you that when there are negative harms, the government is justified in intervening. We give you two analogies. The first is labor regulations. They respond to that. The second is carbon taxation, where the government taxes businesses that cause negative externalities like pollution, so should they too tax businesses that cause negative externalities like massive unemployment. What is their principle? Their principle is one of efficiency. Again, not a principle. This is a practical argument about why they increase efficiency, which I'll get to later. But we tell you again, this practical impact of things going back to the workers does not exist in their world, because when these businesses expand, they just hire more robots. We're not punishing efficiency. We are making up for lost tax revenue, and we are giving this back to the workers that they harm. We think this is principally correct. So why are we ahead on the principle? Because we protect workers, we don't actually hurt the free market, and because as they give to us, taxation is the way that we should alleviate inequality in today's society. So what is the second core area of clash in today's round? Which side is best for workers in the wider economy? We bring to this argument about economic harms. We tell you that unemployment is going to happen about half levels by 2033. Here's the difference between the automation they talk about and the automation we talk about. When they talk about things like conveyor belts or the wheel, things that were invented a pretty long time ago, those are labor enhancing instead of labor replacing. When you actually look at our model and when you actually look at the motion, it talks about things that replace workers. We tell you that when it's easy for large businesses to adopt these automations, they don't have to hire workers in the first place. That's why you see more unemployment. But we think this is way more important than the economic gains they bring you, because first of all, it's better to the economy when more people have jobs and are consuming materials. Second, the idea of decreased costs does not matter if people do not have jobs with which they can produce revenue in order to buy things in this economy. But third, because the unemployed are the most poor and the most vulnerable, they abandon them on their side of the house. What do they tell us? They say, well, people still have to supervise these robots. That is absolutely not an equal trade-off. If you can have one person standing in a factory looking at all of those robots, that does not make up for the fact that probably thousands of people were fired to achieve that. Then the next thing they tell you is that some industries need people like the service industry. First of all, the service industry doesn't need people. Haven't you ever been to McDonald's and seen those little machines shaped like Ronald McDonald where you can place your order? Again, humans are replaceable in a lot of industries. They ignore that for their convenience. But then, the second thing we tell you is, again, that's not equal because most industries still aren't going to be able to fill these replacements. We'll take a POI now if you have one. Go ahead.
Just to be clear, under your side of the house, if an agricultural company gets much better tractors and they lay off half the workforce, would they be taxed or not?
Well, those tractors are still controlled by humans. This is about things that directly replace humans, often using artificial intelligence. But what's the next thing we bring to? We bring to an idea of competition. We tell you the initial cost of these robots is such that only large businesses can buy them. What does that mean? That means small businesses are shut out of the market. Not only is that bad because small businesses are half of the global employment, but that also kills competition because those are what keeps large businesses honest. Now what do they bring in? We bring to you benefits of automation. They tell you cheaper goods exist. First of all, that's not true because there's no competition. Second, people cannot afford them. Then they talk about self-driving cars. We'd say laws can regulate the fact that people are stupid drivers. We don't believe in destroying one of the biggest industries in the achieve this. Things like medical robots are often controlled by humans. That's not a problem on their side of the house. This argument about investments, what they bring to you, which less than the minute left, we believe that overall, when products become more expensive and people can't buy them because of automation, that doesn't happen. What do they ignore on our side of the house? The fact that they fuel populism, the fact that they hurt more workers than they help, the fact that they don't do anything for the economy or efficiency. And that is why we are proud to propose.
Declare proposition speaker spent 8 minutes and 7 seconds. To continue the case of opposition, we call upon Basa.
Mr. Speaker, the whole case of Team USA is based on this premise. Automation will lead to massive unemployment, and therefore, governments should do something about it. However, we believe they themselves don't believe in their own case. Because when we ask them, what is the principal difference between, say, automation and other things that also lead to unemployment, and other more efficient processes, like literally buying a tractor that can replace half of your workforce, they said, well, they didn't actually respond. But they said, no, we wouldn't ban those other things. So notice something very simple. They have not had a consistent case line, a consistent stance in this debate, and therefore, there is no way their argument can prove anything. Okay? 3 main clashes in this debate. Firstly, I'll talk about this whole idea about the pace of automation. Secondly, I'll talk about the whole idea about the principle and the right to competition of the market. And lastly, I'll talk about the effects in the real world. But before doing so, let's go quickly into that strategic flaw in Team USA. So what exactly are they defending in this debate? So what they want to be defending is when automation simply replaces all robots, like all humans everywhere. However, in their last speech, they conceded that even in the worst of cases for under hours of the house, there are still going to be humans employed in factories. Why is this important? Because they can be defending either of two things. They can be defending a world in which automation replaces absolutely everybody, which is a world that is simply not feasible and never going to happen. Or they can be defending a world in which they're talking about things like machinery, in which case you have not been consistent with your own principle, you don't believe it. Now let's go to the first part, which is really related to this whole idea about the pace of automation and whether it will actually lead to losses, which is basically their whole case. So what did they tell us? So, okay, 49% of jobs are going to be lost to automation by 2033. What is the analysis behind that? There wasn't really any. But we told you there are several reasons why that is not going to happen, those things. The first reason why that not going to happen is simply because the technology is not there. Like, yes, we have things like machinery, we have things like robots, we simply not there at a point at which we can simply replace all humans from the workforce. The whole point of which whole case was based on. Like, even in the worst of cases, you're still going to need humans within the workforce. You're still going to need humans to say create the machines, to operate the machines, and to maintain the machines. And those things are now those two things that have been going on for centuries. We don't see the principal difference there. No, thank you. But secondly, even if technology was there, that doesn't necessarily mean that all companies will just bite the bullet and they'll just have automation from today to tomorrow. Why is that? Because companies like automation is a new thing. Companies want to try it out first. They want to test it. They want to see if it works for companies. It's a very important thing. Doesn't mean it won't happen from today to the next day. It means that there is space for things to that. You have to respond to that most thing. But thirdly, maybe most importantly, we already explained why there were always going to be things like new jobs under hours of the house. Why is that? Two main reasons. The first reason is that, well, quite simply, human wants are limited, and there is always going to new demand is always going to be created. Like right now, we have a lot of demand for things that 100 years ago were completely like ridiculous things. Like for example, cell phones or water bottles like this one. The point here is that there will always be new things, and there will always be new demand, there will always be new industries that will be coming up. But secondly, something you yourself said that companies want to make money. And the thing is that under hours of the house, we create the incentive for companies to create structures so that new industries can be developed so they can have consumers. Okay, let's continue. Because even if some jobs are lost, what we will tell you here is that if jobs are lost, the companies will expand operations. So for example, the case of automatic teller machines, which are only automatic and therefore automation. So what happened there was that people were so afraid that all back teller jobs are going to go away. That didn't happen. Why? Because yes, you needed less people to operate each bank. We just had more banks. What we have to recognize here is that in our sort of house, it's not like there is going to be like literally no robots, like no humans anywhere. There are still going to be humans necessary for a function of the company. Companies are just going to configuration, your catastrophic, apocalyptic description and characterization is debate. Very convenient for your stance, not true. But okay, let's continue. Because what we stand for here today is basically this idea of organic change. This idea that, for example, that we need to let the market get to the point when it can get there, and we should not stop it, especially because it brings so many benefits along. Regarding the whole point about, oh my god, we're going to do so much tax revenue, we're going to do so much in income tax. Okay, sure, we might lose on income tax, but if corporations make more money, then we gain more taxes through, say, the corporation taxes, so it's offset, it's not really an important point in this debate. Like, if you want to do all those things, under ours of the house, when corporations are more profitable, we will have more taxes. So on that, the whole case has principally no justification. The whole idea about, oh my god, we need money is not really a good idea. No thing. And let's go to the second question, the whole idea about principles. And what did we tell you? Because it's something very simple. Not that there's going to be more competition though. What we did tell you was that companies had a right to compete, that we shouldn't punish them for being efficient. That if I hire a better manager, and that means instead of needing 12 employees to do the same thing, I use 10 employees, that shouldn't be a reason why you're punishing me. That's a very important thing they have not directly responded to. Like, we should believe that everybody should be in the same plane, so they should not punish companies just because they're more efficient than other companies. That's all. But governments have a right towards their people. I mean, if you, okay, governments might have a right towards foreign employees. Okay, give them welfare. The thing is, we're not necessarily talking about companies.
Sir.
What they want to do is push the burden from the government to specifically the companies. Like we asked you, would you force companies to hire people who are unemployed? They told us no. Why was that so important? I'll take in a second. Because that conceded that I, as a company owner, don't have an obligation to hire people that are unemployed. So you cannot force them to just like hire somebody else because he's unemployed. Same reason. You're basically trying to do the same. Yes, please.
Okay, so you just told us that it's okay to have lower income tax if corporate tax increases. Are you basically telling us that, well, if workers lose money, it's okay as long as the corporation profits?
No, if your whole other idea was based on the fact that the states are going to lose money, like sure you lose money through one kind of tax, but because corporations gain more money, you are gain money through other ways. Okay, now continue. Regarding the whole idea about competition, we will tell you something very similar. So they told us like there's not going to be competition because AI is like always favors these big corporations. First, we believe that if it doesn't have things like AI, they don't necessarily favor corporations like computer science students in like basic nobody can do it. But second, we will tell you that even if that was actually true, you will be in favor by things like machinery because it also overwhelmingly favors big corporations. There's no really principal reason here. Now lastly, let's go to the third flash. The whole point of benefits is a very, very important thing. Because what we put in our sort of house is that in the worst of cases, even if things like jobs are lost, it's still better because the benefits of automation and progress make it up. What we told in our sort of house is that there are hundreds of thousands of people that die because truckers don't respect rules, because laws are not perfect. What I'm not saying, what we're doing is that under our sort of house, we have more lives that are saved because of that. Because process is more efficient because there are no truck drivers in those cases. What we'll do is that if we're going to wait things, and we're going to wait some jobs lost, which there is a much not because new industries are created, and the literal lives of hundreds of people, we should value the literal lives of hundreds of people. But it's also more things, like for example, things like medicine, things like surgeons. Like instead of having to pay this really expensive doctor that went to med school in this really prestigious university, they can do it through a machine that can make process more efficient. It's more like the poor people who have access to those things. We believe those things are very good and there are some house. Regarding the whole idea about, say, for example, that right-wing groups and whatever, we'll tell you that I would respond to that, but it's really pound on everything else. So if you don't prove anything else, it doesn't really make a difference. Ultimately, this debate is very simple. Team USA is not sure what there is coming for. Team Peru is. We believe that organic change can make a difference. We believe that automation will be used for everybody. We believe we should not try to stem the tide of automation. And as much as it's paying me as a Marxist and must concede that free market works, let's not stop the march of progress.
The third position speaker is 8 minutes and 11 seconds. opposition, we call upon Lorenzo.
There is no apocalypse now, there is no apocalypse tomorrow. 2 points of contention. Firstly, about the principles of government intervention and about whether side proposition is really consistent in this debate. Secondly, about the effects of automation. Let's begin with this first point. So, side proposition tells us that the government has a duty to offset the harm brought upon by companies. What they still have to prove to us is that companies should be the ones paying for those offset harms. In order to prove that, side proposition needs to prove that companies have a duty towards the people that they lay off and the people that they do not hire. We do not think that they have such a duty. Why? Because there is a difference between choosing not to hire a person versus actively harming or actively exploiting that person. That is the difference between labor regulations and releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and choosing not to employ another individual. We don't think side proposition has been able to, on principle, draw a significant difference between these things. But secondly, we think that there is also a strong argument to be made that side proposition is not really consistent in this debate, because what they tell us is that the government should offset these harms. But the problem is that if millions of workers are laid off because of labor enhancing rather than labor replacing technology, then side proposition chooses not to intervene. So they need to show a principal difference between a tractor replacing thousands of workers so that very few workers are necessary and eliminating all of those workers altogether. That is a principal distinction that they have been unable to show. They have no principled grounds on this debate. But even if we talk about this debate purely on consequentialist grounds, we think the opposition has still done a better job. Let's move on to the second question. So most of their harms about how so many jobs would be lost were hung on this idea that automation was happening at an impossibly fast pace. A number of responses to this that prove that it doesn't happen. First of all, in many industries, the technology is simply not there and is still being developed. Secondly, it is risky, even if the technology is there, for companies to do it all at once. They still have an incentive to wait for other companies to do it first, or to do it with a very small minority of their workforce. There were no adequate responses to these points from the proposition bench. Furthermore, we talked about things like labor contracts. Companies cannot just ignore the labor contracts of hundreds of thousands of workers and hope that there are no consequences. It would also mean that the pace would be slow. What that means is that there is time for the market to adapt. There is no significant difference between the status quo and all the increases in automation of the past. Furthermore, we've given substantial mechanisms about how jobs would be created under our side of the house. The fact that humans are necessary to create and maintain these technologies. The fact that when it is cheaper for companies to expand, it is more likely that they will hire new workers in the first place. All of these benefits about how automation creates more jobs were not adequately responded to by the proposition. But there are also benefits regardless of jobs, things like safer production. The fact that trucks don't crash and hundreds of people, thousands of people don't die. The fact that green energy is oftentimes produced through automation. Things like artificial intelligence, which is better able to identify tuberculosis and lung cancer instead of doctors. We think that these are significant benefits to society, regardless of jobs, that exist exclusively under our side of the house and that shouldn't be taxed. But they did have a last point here, this idea that they were creating more competition between firms. First of all, this point is hung on an unproven assumption that there are higher startup costs for automation, which isn't always true. Artificial intelligence can in many instances be very cheap. But secondly, we didn't hear an adequate response to why can't large firms compete with other large firms, or would they place a tax on any form of large machinery. What that means is that under our side of the house, there are more jobs, but even if there were significant benefits to society. We make society safer, we make society better. We oppose the motion.
Time speaker from the opposition begins when 4 minutes and 5 seconds.
We now conclude the case for the proposition and the debate as a whole. I call upon Aditya.
You need someone to drive a tractor, you don't need someone to drive a self-driving tractor. We tax one of those, we wouldn't tax the other. I hope that clears up the contradiction that opposition assumes. Two questions in this round, first on the principle, then on the practical, but before that, a quick clarification on our model. Here's what they say. They try to tell you they can do worker retraining, but first we tell you that their side has no money. Their only answer to this is, well, corporate tax revenue is going to increase. We say no, like you see corporate tax shelters in the status quo, like we don't see why revenue is suddenly going to massively increase. But second, we tell you slowing the pace is very important. Our side is the only one that can actually achieve retraining in the long run. I'll talk about why that's beneficial under the practical. First question on the principle. What is the principle that they came to with? The idea that governments have a principal obligation not to infringe on competition and efficiency. We gave three responses to this. First, it's not a principle, it's a practical argument. But second, we tell you efficiency is generally good because it helps companies hire workers. That's their bank teller example. The difference is when you have like automation in a manufacturing sector, corporations literally use that automation to increase efficiency, to buy more robots, like they don't actually increase workers in the long run. That's why the principle of efficiency doesn't stand. But third, this idea of competition does not exist when you shut out small businesses. Their literal only response is large businesses still exist. Okay, it's not a monopoly, it's an oligopoly. Large businesses collude all the time. I don't see why competition magically increases under their side of the house. What is the principle we came to with today? We told you why it's justified to correct for market failures. We gave you reasons why this was important. But the principle analysis that wasn't engaged with was the idea of a moral signaling value. The idea that government taxes and promotes exactly what it endorses and subsidizes, right? So government has a principal obligation to point out what's wrong. We think that is the case of automation. That's why we have a principled stance in this round. But we think the practical is really important, especially if you buy their analysis that like all principles are contingent on the practical. So let's talk about the practical, right? We give you three mechanisms for why you create economic devastation. First, the immediate shock to these industries. Second, the massive increase in unemployment. Third, small business getting shut out of the market, right? How did they respond to it? They responded by saying, well, it's not as fast as you think it's going to have because costs are prohibitively expensive. At the point where the reply speaker literally said, well, artificial intelligence is often cheap, we don't see why costs are prohibitively expensive. We've seen massive replacement going on in the manufacturing sector, right? Their only other response to this idea that companies want to try it out, they're hesitant to try it at first. No, they've been trying it out for the last 10 years. That's why you see massive job loss because of automation, right? Their only other response is this continued analogy about the Industrial Revolution. We told you why this was a comparable model for our side back in second, right? So what's their best argument in this round? Their best argument is the idea that no, robots actually do good things. But we gave you three reasons why that argument didn't stand. First, they're not looking at a majority of robots. They're looking at a very narrow scale, right? But second, we would say that the ban that they keep accusing us of doesn't actually exist, right? Like we would support self-driving cars. Like Tesla can make a self-driving car because that's not labor replacing. But the point at which you have labor replacing vehicles, we think you create economic devastation, right? But still, if you agree with their argument that still says, well, a small scale of robots are good, we think the scale of economic devastation far outweighs this. When you do not have a job, you cannot access the new industries argument that came out in like opposition 3, but at their highest ground, let's say the end result is the same on both sides, right? Let's say you have the same number of jobs on both sides. Our side is far better because what you do is you prevent massive economic devastation in the short run. We tell you the pace is accelerating. We tell you workers need to be retrained, but the only way that you can achieve that is under our side of the house. Look, we give you a lot of economic speak in this round, and I know our American accents don't make it prettier. Here's what's important. When Ella says that unemployment increases, it means workers can't feed their families. When Ellie says wages drop, it means workers can't buy medicine for their children. Our side is the only side that stands up for them. That's why we're so proud to propose.